In today's world, ethical dilemmas are more prevalent than ever, leaving us to question the decline in our moral compass. Should we rely solely on codes of ethics or foster ethical cultures? Should we delegate our morals to the government? Join us as we navigate these critical questions and how companies should face them. I'm your host, Yoram Solomon, and here with me today are SMU Professor of Practice in the Management Department who teaches classes on accounting ethics, Scott Hensley. Also, Richard Bowen, who was a business chief underwriter at Citigroup in 2007 and became a whistleblower, first internally, then in front of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and ultimately testified before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission that investigated the 2007 financial crisis. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Scott, I'm going to start with you. When the Enron case broke, what were you doing?
What was I doing? That's a really interesting question. I was actually a senior in college studying accounting as an accounting major. And I remember sitting in my advanced accounting course watching Enron unfold live on TV. So rather than open our textbook and learn about advanced accounting, we were pulling up national news and front page of Wall Street Journal articles to learn about Enron, and obviously Jeff Skilling having ties to the university. We were all very fascinated to watch what was unfolding from an accounting perspective, especially as somebody who was at the same time about to graduate and look for a job in accounting as all these things were happening.
Did that in any way affect the fact that today you're teaching classes on accounting ethics?
Sure, absolutely. So part of that was the timing that all these scandals and issues were happening, but also my career in accounting started by focusing on Sarbanes-Oxley and the things that came out of Enron. And so I followed that in my professional career as an auditor and was always fascinated to see what companies were doing back then and even now today. And so looking at what's changed over that time really made me interested in teaching accounting ethics, both from what's happened in the past and what's happening more today.
So our topic today is ethics, and the Cambridge Dictionary defined ethics as a system of accepted beliefs of controlled behavior, especially such a system based on moral. Mm-hmm. Scott, what is your definition of ethics?
My definition of ethics, I think, is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. And that can be impacted by your morals and your personal values, but to me, ethics is doing the right thing when nobody's looking.
Doing the right thing when nobody's looking. I like that definition. Mm-hmm. Richard, I'll turn to you. You were a whistleblower for Citigroup in 2007. What effect do you feel that you had being a whistleblower?
Well, you have to understand, in 2006, the Citigroup was purchasing over $90 billion in mortgages from other banks and mortgage companies. These were not that they made. And they were turning around and they were selling them. And they all went into mortgage securities. And when they sold them, they would give their guarantees. They would give their representations and warranties that the mortgages met their policy guidelines, Citigroup's policy guidelines. Well, my underwriters, I had 220 underwriters, my underwriters were telling me that over 60% of these mortgages did not meet their policy guidelines. And they were defective. And yet Citigroup was selling these, guaranteeing that they were not defective. And so I started issuing warnings. I issued warnings. I sent email. I put it in my weekly report. I made committee presentations. And this went on for over 18 months. And but that's how I got into this whole thing, and being a whistleblower.
But did you feel that being the whistleblower, you had an impact? Did you feel that you made a difference as a result?
Well, for 18 months, I certainly didn't. That is for dang sure. But that was part of the story there, because I was not having an impact. And yet these were huge mortgage securitizations that were going to blow up. They were going to blow up on Citi, the investors, the retirement funds that were purchasing these. And quite frankly, I ultimately decided I had to go to the board of directors. I had to go to the top And so I sent a very specific email to Robert Rubin, who was the new chairman of the board. And I also sent it to the executive officers and the chief auditor. And I said, there are huge issues here. We are selling these mortgages guaranteeing that they are good mortgages, and they are not good mortgages. And at that time, they basically stripped me of my responsibilities and told me not to come back to Citigroup.
But at that time, this is 2007, so this is after Sarbanes-Oxley already came out.
Yes.
They were in violation of Sarbanes-Oxley, weren't they?
Yes, they were. As a matter of fact, under Sarbanes-Oxley, you have to swear, you have to guarantee every quarter that the internal controls are effective. And they were saying the internal controls were effective. And in my email, I pointed out internal controls are broken. I'm a CPA. I knew they had to sign that certification. That's why I structured it that way.
So the company was breaking the law, essentially.
Yes.
Were they also breaking their own code of ethics?
Well, of course they were. It was not only were they breaking their own code of ethics, they were violating their own policies. Their own policies dictate that they had to have in excess of 90% good mortgages before they would buy them and sell them. And yet 60% were defective, and that grew to over 80%.
So their code of ethics was, I would say, the higher level than the law, than Sarbanes-Oxley, was more restrictive than Sarbanes-Oxley?
Well, a code of ethics is really a expected behavior of employees. Sarbanes-Oxley codified part of this and basically said that all companies have to, that are publicly traded, you have to basically evaluate the internal controls, define the internal controls, and certify that the internal controls are effective. That is a legal term. That is required under Sarbanes-Oxley. And obviously, theirs weren't effective. The internal controls were broken.
Scott, so why do companies create codes of ethics? Do they create it with the intention of complying with them? Do they create it just to create a show?
All of the above. I think it can depend on the company or the organization. I do think there are a lot out there that put those code of ethics in place because they want to follow them and they believe in them and they're very important. And to your point, they raise a certain bar to make sure people do what they're supposed to be doing internally with the company. But also, I'm sure there are organizations out there that create these code of ethics as a way to kind of show the world publicly, and we've obviously talked about some companies that didn't have a very strong code. They show how great it is, but then they don't follow it. So sure, I think there are companies out there that sort of put on a show, and others that take it very seriously.
Richard, do you feel that Citigroup was taking their code of ethics very seriously, or were they putting on a show?
No, it was obviously a show. Every employee had to take classes every year and know the code of ethics. It was a lengthy code of ethics, and it was taught by an academic type in a classroom. But the employees knew that that really wasn't the way things worked. And, employees know this.
So when a company hires a new employee, they typically have the employee sign that you will comply with the code of ethics. Is this to transfer the responsibility to the employee?
I think it is an attempt to make the employee feel a part of it. But quite frankly, then they have to truly believe it and incorporate it and expect the employees to adhere to it. And that's where the breakdown occurs.
I also think it can cover the larger organization and say, look, they signed this document, they knew what was going on, we're covered. And I don't think that's always right.
So it's interesting. Enron happened, and right after that, Congress enacted Sarbanes-Oxley. Is it fair to say that what we have done is delegated ethical behavior to Congress, to laws?
If you're asking me, quite frankly, I don't, it would be one thing if Congress actually enforced it. They did not enforce it. As a matter of fact, I'm not aware of any prosecution. And understand, Sarbanes-Oxley also makes it illegal to retaliate against someone that reports wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there has ever been a prosecution under Sarbanes-Oxley. Mm-hmm. So it's a law on the books that people like to point to, and it's not that effective. As a matter of fact, it even under Sarbanes-Oxley, the auditors have to issue a separate audit opinion on the internal controls of the company, that they are legally effective, and that has not changed anything.
Scott, what do you feel? Do you feel that when Sarbanes-Oxley and other laws like that have been created, it was really us delegating ethical behavior to laws?
In some cases, yes, but I also think it's very reactionary, right? And
yes.
And as he pointed out, there hasn't been a lot of consequences for not following those laws. So I think when certain when government gets involved, it's very reactionary. And so in this case, the damage had been done, and then long term, there hasn't been a lot of teeth behind Sarbanes as far as if you didn't comply.
But not all companies break or violate their own codes of ethics.
Certainly not.
So is this a case where a few bad apples who violate their own codes of ethics cause the government to create laws that now are imposed on other companies and create hardship for other companies?
Yes, I believe so, especially if you look at the size of some of these, Enron and others, and how big the financial impact was and how many people were impacted. I think the government felt like they had to respond,
yes.
But then ultimately it hurt a lot of other, particularly, as you pointed out earlier, smaller companies that maybe weren't doing anything unethical, and now they were sort of burdened with these additional laws and compliance issues they had to follow.
So back to codes of ethics, companies that create codes of ethics. I think that by definition we assume that it's going to be more restrictive, it's going to require things that are not required by law. Mm-hmm. Should there be consequences built into the codes of ethics for violations of the codes of ethics by the company or its employees?
If you want them to have more teeth and have people have a higher compliance rate to those codes of ethics, yeah, I think there needs to be consequences to those, because when there's not, you have people not complying and nothing's happening, so why do I need to worry about this? But yeah, I think if there are specific concrete consequences to breaking the code, I think that could increase compliance, of course.
Richard, what do you think?
And that's typically, if you're an employee and you do not follow the code of ethics, then you're terminated.
Right.
You're toast. That's what should be happening. It's not just codified. And that's where the breakdown occurs, because the companies do not enforce the code of, or some may choose not to enforce the code of ethics. And, the code of ethics is a benchmark. It describes what is preferred employee behavior in different circumstances. And some companies do follow it. But quite frankly, it's not anything that is necessarily widespread.
Well, here's an interesting question in this case. So we are pushing companies to enforce their code of ethics, but when there are consequences and they enforce the code of ethics, employees treat that as the law. There are extrinsic consequences for violating it. Shouldn't companies instead build cultures of ethics, ethical cultures, instead of a very robust code of ethics?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The expectations of a code of ethics needs to be implicit in a corporate culture. It needs to be embraced. And that, quite frankly, is, we can talk about, is one of the real signs of a code of ethics.
Scott, what do you think?
I've been fortunate to have some speakers in my class from some larger organizations and firms, and one of the things that I'm seeing and my students are seeing that I think speaks to what you just said is these codes of ethics used to be these massive documents that was very difficult to even understand if you wanted to understand them. And what you're seeing from the folks that have come to my class is there's a push for these larger organizations and firms to shrink the code of ethics to something that's easier to digest,
Yes.
easier to understand and follow, and it is more focused on a cultural, creating a culture based on a much simpler ethical values, as opposed to what you used to see was this stack of code of ethics and rules. I think you're seeing a shift more towards let's create something simpler, but that is more focused on creating an ethical culture.
If you're a new employee and you've just joined a company, how would you know if this company is ethical or not?
Well, that's a great question, because the employees typically know, as we may talk about later. The employees typically know if they're truly expected. I mean, truly expected to do what is right and not do what is wrong.
How would you know that as a new employee?
It's very difficult to, quite frankly. It is.
Let's give our viewers who are right now thinking about joining a new company, let's give them a couple of tips of how would you know that you are about to be hired for an ethical company?
Well, obviously, you can talk about ethics. You can bring up talking about their code of ethics and what their expectations are, and try to establish an understanding or a feel. Are they truly sincere? Are they truly committed to the code of ethics? That's what you're trying. It's not black and white.
Sure.
Now, once you're with the company and you begin to see the inner workings, then you can very quickly determine if it's an ethical organization or not. If people are doing the wrong things from a correct or a right perspective.
Sure.
What would you say, Scott? How
So-
would you know? How would a new employee know that
Great
this
question.
is an ethical company?
One of the things that I encourage my students to do is talk to people who used to work at the company you're about to start working for that don't work there anymore. Because I think
good
once
point.
they get outside of that, that's your company, that's where you work, that's your bubble, that's who signs your paycheck, so to speak. But once you leave, maybe you can have some more open discussions about, okay, what was it like to used to work there? What was it like when you were there? Can you tell me anything I should know? Just have discussions with people that used to work there, ask what their experience was, maybe why they left. And that's a little bit, early on, because I think to your point, you got to be in there for a while
Yes.
to understand if it's truly ethical or not, because they can tell you whatever they want to tell you, right? But if you don't work there anymore, that's a little bit different perspective, and maybe they can give you a little bit deeper insights to if it was a really, ethical place or not.
And probably first ask if they have signed an NDA,
NDA,
before
right.
they left the company.
Right.
Our audience right now are going to watch this graph that you provided that was created by the Ethics Compliance Initiative in 2018, and we thank the Ethics Compliance Initiative for allowing us to use this chart. What are they saying? What are they seeing?
Well, first of all, understand the Ethics and Compliance Initiative is a world-famous nonprofit that studies substantial issues of ethics, and every year they do an incredibly in-depth research project and publish the results of that. And the chart that you're looking at now, they worked with hundreds of companies around the world, and the companies agreed to work with them if they were anonymous. And so the ECI actually evaluated the ethics programs of all of these companies. And what you see here is a graph of basically dividing the companies up from those that actually very little in the way of ethics from evaluating their programs to the most ethical, the highest quality. And what ECI did then was they took a survey of something like 10,000 employees of these companies around the world. And among these, they asked two specific questions. Did you see misconduct at work, and did you report it? And the second question was, how satisfied were you that you reported it? So, for example, take a look at the left quadrant, the quadrant, obviously, which is the least ethical. Here, 34% of the employees saw misconduct and reported it. And you think, well, okay. And then it also says of those that reported it, only 20% were glad they did. So what happened to the other 80%? They were discriminated against. They were ridiculed. They were demoted. They were made to regret that they ever reported anything. That's why only 34% reported it, because they saw what happened to those that did. Now look in the right quadrant. In the right quadrant, 93% of the employees saw misconduct and reported it. And of those that reported it, 94% were glad they did. They were satisfied. So what happened to those employees? Those employees were made to feel that they were a part of the company. They were a part and parcel. Their feedback was important. It was valued. And the employees were embraced by management. And they might have misunderstood what they saw. The management explained that to them, but they took time and they monitored this process. If you want an ethical corporation, you have to make the employees feel that they are a part of the company. Their feedback is important and they are valued. That is truly the mark of an ethical corporation.
So if I summarize what our viewers have just watched, on the left, companies with lower ethical standards, you would see that fewer employees would report something, and you would see that even fewer would be happy that they reported.
Oh, yeah. And fewer report it because they see what happened to those that report it.
And on the right side, those who, companies with higher ethical standards, we would see more employees report whenever they see something. Probably they see fewer things, but more of them do report. And more of them are happier that they have reported.
Yes, absolutely. Because they were reinforced. Their feedback was valued by management, and management shared that with them.
How should companies create ethical standards, their own code of ethics?
Well,
so I think I'll start. So to create it from scratch, I think you have to look at the overall goals of the organization. So obviously, if it's a for-profit, you're obviously going to consider financial implications, but are there other goals around, greater good for the area that you're in or greater good for your employees? What are your overall goals of your organization beyond just a P&L? And then you start to say, okay, what does that look like from a cultural standpoint? What type of employees fit that culture? But I think you have to look at the overall goals of the organization, certainly financial, but also otherwise, to see how to even start to build a code of ethics, because it's an easy thing to talk about maybe, but it's a hard thing to do.
Yes, no, it absolutely is. But the most important ingredient here is making the employees feel like they are a part of the company, and they need to give feedback to the company. What is right that is happening, and what is not right that is happening. And the companies need to make them feel that they are a part truly of the fabric of the company.
So when companies create codes of ethics and then break their own codes of ethics, why do they do that?
It's a matter of, basically it's greed.
Sure.
They act in their own self-best interest. And that's the key denominator for this.
Yeah, if you look at a lot of the bigger ethical scandals, particularly that happened in the early 2000s and even today, a lot of them are greed at the top.
Yes.
And then, as he mentioned, and then the other is a lot of pressure around earnings and beating earnings. So you have C-suites of people that are extremely greedy and out for their own personal interest and gain and whatever they want to do personally. But also there's a tremendous amount of pressure on financial earnings and Wall Street and beating earnings. And that takes people that maybe started on an ethical path but then got more and more pressure to meet or exceed those earnings. And then they started kind of scooting closer and closer to that ethical bar. And then they went further and further and eventually potentially crossed the legal bar as well.
Richard, you suffered personal consequences for being a whistleblower. Can you briefly say something about that?
Well, when I went to the board of directors, I was stripped of all my responsibilities and told not to come back. And that's when I went to the SEC and gave them over 1,000 pages of documents showing the massive fraud that was going on. And then 3 months after I testified for the SEC, that's when Citigroup was bailed out by the U.S. government to the tune of $2.8 trillion in loans and capital and toxic asset and liability guarantees. And the SEC covered up my testimony. And then I went to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. And quite frankly, they forced me to change part of my testimony because they did not want it revealed that I had testified before the SEC and gave them government full knowledge of what was going on at Citigroup before they bailed them out.
So if someone came to you today and said, Richard, I'm seeing something bad in my company is not meeting its own ethical standards, what would you advise them to do?
I would advise them to, if they feel up to it, to ask a question, raise their hand. But if they're going to pursue that, they need to get a professional legal advisor.
From outside of the company?
Yes.
So, very brief, very personal. If you were back in that same position in 2007, would you do it again?
Yes, I would. It was right. I was ultimately vindicated. The mortgages all showed huge losses that led to the financial crisis, and it wasn't just Citigroup. This was all the banks that were doing it. So yes, I would do it again.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. I want to close with a quote from former Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Potter Stewart. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. I hope we gave you ideas on how to reverse the downward spiral of our business ethics, or at least enough to think about. Thank you for watching our program today. Please continue joining us as we continue to talk about things that matter with people who care.